Hello and welcome from Guadalajara, Mexico, to this episode of Crossing Borders with Nathan Lustig, where I have conversations with entrepreneurs doing business across borders and the people who support them, with a focus on those with some connection to Latin America. This episode is brought to you by latemlist.com. If you like this podcast, you'll enjoy Latemlist's daily tech news reporting. Sign up for the mailing list and get weekly email updates. My guest today is Cory Siskind, founder of Base Operations, a Washington, D.C., Mexico City-based company that uses data to help multinationals keep their employees safe in emerging markets. Magma Partners invested in Cory and Base back in 2018. In this episode, we talk about Cory's early interest in emerging markets, her first time living in Mexico, and how she came up with the idea for Base Operations. We also talk about how a Harvard business plan competition pushed Cory to start the business, how Cory and her team validated the idea over 2 months in Mexico City, and what it's like operating between the US and Mexico. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Crossing Borders with my guest, Cory Siskind. Hey, Cory, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being willing to do it.
Thanks, Nate. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about what you're working on at Base Operations.
Sure. So Base Operations is a platform that helps companies keep their global workforce safe and connected, especially in emerging markets. So we have a dashboard for security personnel and an app for employees. The dashboard helps security personnel do things like monitor employee geolocation, use our proprietary data for analysis, coordinate crisis management, et cetera. And the app has intuitive heat maps, geofenced alerts, safe routing, like the safest way from point A to point B. So basically, we're a suite of products that help a company keep their global workforce safe and connected all around the world.
And what kind of data are you giving to these companies, or what kind of data is in the product that helps people make decisions on keeping employees safe?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we really specialize in high crime, low transparency markets. By that, I mean markets in which the crime rates are so high that it impacts people's day-to-day life, business operations, but they lack access to information about what's going on around them. So in response to that problem, we have a patent-pending algorithm that gathers data from various sources, like you mentioned. So our data comes from crowdsourced reports that come into our app, social media that we scrape, local news, government statistics, and data from organizations that we partner with. So we aggregate all of that data and create intuitive heat maps and visualizations to essentially help people understand their surroundings and get ground truth instantaneously.
What's it like without your service today? What are the big companies that are sending employees to, say, Mexico doing today that they could be using your app for?
So the sort of standard practice in the industry currently is to give your employees perhaps a 30-page country risk report. So a consulting firm will put together sort of stock information about that city so that you have an idea of where you're going. And that's kind of the best practice. That's sort of what companies do that are the most concerned about employee safety. The problem with that, of course, is that if you're traveling for work, you're probably busy, you're preparing for the meeting that you'll be attending, and you're unlikely to read a 30-page risk report about the city that you're going to. So how Base Operations is different, we provide dynamic information, just-in-time information. So when you touch down in a new city, you can open it up, and even when you're there in the airport or on your way to the meeting, get a feel for your surroundings, have an understanding of where you are, how to get around safely with our features like safe routing. And so it's just much more a product built for a modern traveler that's used to products like Uber and Airbnb that are responsive and dynamic and quick. So we provide information just as you need it.
So we're going to talk more about Base Operations in a little bit here, but I want to jump back into your story first. Where are you from originally?
I'm from Piedmont, California, which is inside of Oakland, California. So I grew up in the Bay Area.
And did you know you always wanted to be an entrepreneur, or was it something that came up in your career path?
I definitely did not know that I wanted to be an entrepreneur, and it's something that surfaced relatively later in my career. I always earlier on I thought I would be a lawyer, but then I realized I was really passionate about emerging markets, and so wasn't sure that lifestyle would go over so well if I wanted to spend a lot of time abroad. So I got involved in security and risk management. That was sort of a particular interest academically. I studied international security, and then just sort of started going down this path and came to entrepreneurship much later when I was actually in an entrepreneurial finance class in my master's program. And I had always had this idea. I put together a financial model and a business plan just sort of as an academic exercise. And I got a lot of positive feedback from the professor. And he said, you really should give this a try. This is really interesting. Go out and recruit a team to work on like a competition. So I did a pitch just for kind of practice. Wasn't sure anyone would come talk to me, but I was at Harvard at the time, and I did this pitch, and I had all these statisticians, computer scientists, really smart people that wanted to work on this idea that I proposed. So we put together a team and competed in this business plan competition. And ended up being one of the winners. So we got our first non-dilutive capital from that, and that was just sort of the turning point that really got me interested in entrepreneurship, and it just sort of snowballed from there.
What was it like going from more of the, say, more academic side into a business plan competition and having to execute something probably fairly quickly and get it in front of people and get it in front of judges to be able to win?
That's a good question. I think my background in management consulting really helped because you can think about a huge problem and then break it down into pieces. And essentially in something as academic as a business plan competition where they're really just looking for, if this were a business, how would you format it? Being able to break down the different components and think about like, okay, what would the product look like, and who would our customer be, and how would we deliver this service, and what would our different channels be? That just sort of came naturally to me, and I think part of that flowed from the fact that base operations and the idea behind it meets such a need. So all of those pieces sort of fell into place.
So you mentioned you got passionate about emerging markets. How did that happen?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I studied international relations at Tufts as an undergrad. I was always interested in Latin America, actually, even before university. When I was in high school, I would go to Mexico for different kind of community service and engagement projects. And I loved Spanish. I was a huge Spanish nerd, and so would listen to podcasts and the radio and trying and speak to whoever I could, always trying to improve my Spanish. So I've always been interested in Latin America. And then when I was at Tufts, I sort of became particularly interested in international security and how organized criminal networks can hold back development, particularly how they damage business and how that impacts access, to capital, just expansion of different businesses and development and, people's economic capability for growth. So I read, books that really influenced me, like Illicit by Moises Naim, that talked about how all organized criminal networks are connected. After that, I graduated. I spent some time in Washington, D.C. in the think tank world, but I realized that I was much more interested in being in the field and actually working in security and risk management and helping companies enter emerging markets. So I moved to Mexico City to work for Control Risk, which is the market leading company in security and risk management. And I became a geopolitical risk analyst, where I was an expert on different cities, and I would advise clients on where to build pipelines or where to house teams, or how cities were changing in terms of their security trends. So I loved that, but I was also just sort of overwhelmed by the lack of information. I always knew that organized criminal networks posed a huge problem to developments and to the safety of cities. But I was surprised by this particular component of the problem, which is that no one knows what's going on, and that has far-reaching effects for policy, for instability, for companies not knowing how to operate and what the city will be like from one day to the next. So I became particularly interested in that lack of transparency, violence against journalists, sort of corruption of government statistics, and all of the reasons that contribute to this environment where you have these high crime, low transparency cities.
What were some of the, besides for the lack of transparency, what were the next couple of most interesting things that you think like you know about because you're in the market that most people say in the US or even in Latin America wouldn't know about these markets?
I think when you have a city or a country that has a large organized crime presence, people don't understand how dynamic that can be. I think one of the major misconceptions that Americans have about Mexico is that it's all dangerous and it's all dangerous all the time. And you get that from watching movies like Sicario and sort of this fascination with the drug trade. But in reality, it's quite cyclical and things are changing all the time. So, Juarez will be really dangerous for a couple years while some cartels are fighting for dominance, and then that will calm down and it'll move to another city. And even within cities, different seasons, different weeks, even different times of day can see really dramatically different crime patterns. So I think people tend to paint these markets with a broad brush, but in reality, there's a really dynamic nature to how crime and insecurity impacts people's lives and business.
So you have an interesting background in that you have studied both thinking about Latin America. You've also done a business degree with an MBA, and you've done studied at the School of Government at Harvard. How have you thought about how all of those interact together to kind of support what you do today?
That's interesting. I think the number one thing I see with entrepreneurship in Latin America is that it tends to import business models that are really successful in the US and Europe and just sort of transplant them to Latin America. And I think one of the things that I learned spending a lot of time in Latin America, working in business and now being in entrepreneurship, is that you really have to solve a problem that you feel acutely and that's local and relatable to you. So while a lot of companies have seen great success, sort of replicating business models in these new markets, and there's definitely a lot of value from that, I think what's really exciting is to use entrepreneurship to solve local problems. And I think that's something that's growing, in Magma's portfolio. I see that as well. But I think that's the new face of entrepreneurship in Latin America is solving problems that are more oriented around its markets that are, also related to larger markets like base operations. We solve a problem for multinational companies that are operating in emerging markets. But I think being able to solve something local first and then internationalize that solution.
So when you were in the business plan competition and you ended up getting some equity free capital to start going, what actually pushed you to do it? Because many times people will do, say, the business plan competitions and they'll maybe win a little bit of money, but it's like, you know what, I can go and make a ton of money working as a consultant again, or I can get a really good job somewhere else and not have very much risk. What pushed you to actually start the business and go out on this entrepreneurial journey?
So to answer your question, what really made me kind of take it seriously and take the first real steps? Two things: support from incredible mentors, and also talking to the people that we wanted to serve. So I'll talk about each of those. We got non-dilutive capital from this business plan competition. It was the Harvard President's Challenge. Then sort of soon after that, we ended up getting a small grant from MIT's Sandbox Fund. And I connected with a mentor through that program, Maureen Boyce, who was just an incredible mentor and really took this seriously and encouraged me to take it seriously. So she was really instrumental in the beginning in helping us turn this into more than just an idea for a product, into a functioning business. She also later became an investor. She invested through her venture capital fund. So having an incredible network of support. I also had different organizations through MIT and Harvard, different programs that supported us. And that really, if I was shy about taking that step at first, they were really the ones that identified that there was some substance there, and through grants, through mentorship, all these different resources, they really sort of propelled me forward. So I feel incredibly lucky to have been in that environment and been exposed to those support systems. So finding a mentor where you can, I think, is really helpful. And then the second piece is, and this is probably the most important piece, is just talking to the people that we were trying to serve and have them be incredibly passionate about the solution that we were working on, and really grateful that someone was working on the problem. So we had, as I mentioned, a small amount of capital. We went down to Mexico City in July 2017 and worked. We brought in all of these, I think 100 people from our target demographic, and we had them play around with a really hacked together version of what we would eventually build later. And we observed them playing with it. We monitored the analytics of their usage. We surveyed them, and the results were overwhelmingly positive. This was something that they really wanted in their lives. They'd never seen anything like it. No one was working on the problem. And so, that initially with sort of just residents of Mexico City was really powerful. And then also as we sort of upgraded and turned to focus more on the enterprise version of base operations, meeting with security teams, chief security officers, and having them say, there are all these products in the market, but no one is getting it right. No one is using technology. No one's making an intuitive product that really engages employees so that they're bought in, so that when it comes time to check in for a crisis, they know where to go because we've created a product that's already adding value in their day-to-day lives. So I think just talking to our customers, talking to users, and getting their response and feeding off their energy and positivity helps us go forward and continue to take the next steps.
Going to Mexico and getting it into potential users' hands is really interesting strategy, and it's something that some of the most successful companies that we've seen always are able to do some sort of a quick test to validate that it works. And it's something that I think many entrepreneurs don't get right, because especially new entrepreneurs don't get right. So how much time and money, more or less, do you think it took you to do that test in Mexico City?
So we took about 2 months. We spent less than $20,000 all in, and that included we paid a contractor, we paid a developer to work with us, and create a workable version of the product. There were 3 of us at the time. We all lived in an Airbnb in the Roma neighborhood of Mexico City. We were totally sick of each other by the end because we were living and working in the same tiny apartment. But it was enough time and enough of an investment that it provided that validity, that sort of verification that we needed to move forward and to understand that we, really hit on something that mattered to people and that they weren't seeing elsewhere in the market.
So after the Mexico City test, what were the next steps that you and the team took?
So after the Mexico City test, so it's also important to remember that we were all in school at the time. So that was a little disruptive because we had to go to class, which we rarely did. But we kind of had to work with summers and January breaks. So we really phased out the first summer, because my program was 3 years. The first summer we tested this version that was essentially, we used touchscreen computers and brought in people to test it out. The second summer we went back down and had an actual version of the app that's it was pretty clunky, but it had heat maps. That was sort of the main feature. It had filters, different other things, but we wanted to prove and verify that visualizing this information added value to people's lives, even if we would add on other things later, like better geofenced alerts and routing and all these things. But we just wanted to verify that alone added value for people. So first we launched just the desktop version that was really hacked together, and then we launched an early version of the app. Then in summer 2018, we launched a version of our enterprise version. So we started putting that together. That's while we were in TechStars. So a super iterative approach to building something, synthesizing that feedback, making sure that we were building in the right direction, and then taking that back to the next version.
So you mentioned TechStars. How did you decide to do an accelerator? Which TechStars program did you do, and what was the experience like?
So we did TechStars Impact, which is based in Austin, Texas. There were 5 of us at the time, me and essentially a lot of developers, and it was a really special experience. It was a big decision because obviously most accelerator programs like TechStars and Y Combinator take a piece of equity that's pretty significant, and so that was a big decision to make. Like, did we want to kind of marry TechStars in a way and go on this journey with them? And I think the process of actually being there helped us really take a very metrics driven approach. That's already sort of my inclination, but they have this philosophy about a revenue formula and testing different parts of the components that lead to revenue. So we did that all summer, and it was just a really helpful framework to work with. And then I also think the best part about TechStars for me has been after TechStars and sort of having a management level through mentorship. Like I have weekly calls with our program managers, Zoe Schlag, and so just having people that you can sort of bounce ideas off of, and who are bought into your success. They've just been a really active part of our growth. So yeah, in general, it was a great experience. It's not for everyone, but it worked out really well for us.
What advice would you give to entrepreneurs that do get accepted into TechStars to take the most advantage of their time in the program?
That's a good question. I think what's so challenging about TechStars is that you are trying to take in so much information and operate your business like normal at the same time. So you'll have all day meetings with mentors, and then you're pretty much at night scrambling to make sure that those upgrades get pushed out, or that you send those business development emails or whatever it is. I actually think the single most impactful and helpful thing for me was getting into the habit of writing a monthly update email to stakeholders. That's TechStars encouraged us to do that weekly during the program, and I said I won't do that, but I will do it once a month, and I will do that after the program finishes, and I'll continue to do it. So I think writing a monthly newsletter has been impactful for in a couple ways. It helps keep the team to task. Like, we're always sort of like, okay, what do we want to do by the end of this month? How do we want to talk about it? We want to show people what we've done. So let's really push forward and make sure that this is done by that date so we can tell people about it. So it adds sort of an element of pressure that makes us work harder and faster and better. And then it also allows us to keep in touch with our network. So I've had multiple investors pass initially and then come back because of the progress that they've been tracking through our update emails. So I think my piece of advice about TechStars is, take that seriously and start practicing in TechStars, and then carry it after the program.
Yeah, you have one of the best monthly email updates of anybody that we get, or any of the emails that we get sent, and we get sent a lot. What are some of the key things to include in an email update that you found to be drivers of success for you?
I think it's important to include your highlights, and that's what gets our team, motivated. We want to essentially brag to people like about all the hard work we're doing. That's important, but we've also had so much good come from including where people can help, because sometimes people think all that startups want is investment, and just venture capital to keep going. But there's so much more that people can do to help us, and people who have who are our stakeholders who want to help us, but maybe they're not investors. They want to help in some other way. So asking people for press connections, if you want to hire a data scientist, those are recent asks from our latest update that you saw, Nate. But people really want to help, and they really come through. So that's been a great way to sort of mobilize people and concentrate all of those asks in one place.
So what tips would you give, besides for the email update, what tips would you give to entrepreneurs looking to raise money?
I think the lesson that I wish I had learned before starting the whole process of fundraising was just that your time is super valuable, and there are people out there that don't realize how damaging it is to take up an entrepreneur's time, but you just have to be, as an entrepreneur, you have to be super disciplined about protecting your time. And so I've had a, I've had and I've seen other entrepreneurs have instances where they go through these really long due diligence processes, and it in the end, after taking months of review and interviews, etc., it doesn't come to anything, and it takes only one or two experiences like that to realize that you have to hold people to task, because they'll just take as much of your time as they want. So being really strict about having a process in place, like this is how we do it, here's our deal room, etc., and not just, I think, having the confidence to do that and not feeling like you need to chase every no, or chase every investor. You can let them go if they're not working on your timetable.
Yeah, that's good advice. And so going back into the business itself, what kind of companies do you think should be using the product?
There are a couple qualities that make a company a good potential customer for base operations. First, because we're really focused on global workforce and emerging markets, they should be a multinational. So have several offices all around the world potentially. For us, we're starting in Latin America, but we certainly have a global vision. So a company that has offices around the world and people in all of those offices. Another important part for us, we look for companies that prioritize their workforce and really view them as their number one asset. So when we ran a pilot with Bain and Company, that's a company that really cares about their consultants. They don't have a lot of, installations, manufacturing plants, et cetera. Their main asset are their people. So they're really invested in keeping them safe. So that ended up being a good partner for us.
And what kind of operations or what kind of things are the companies most interested in the product? Is it the information about what areas of the city maybe their workers shouldn't be going into? Is it something along the features of what happens in a disaster? Like what are the top things that people are most interested in?
Two things. So companies are most interested in my experience, in preventative security measures, and then also crisis management. So when I say preventative, I mean companies want their employees to be making safer choices so that they don't get into problems in the first place. So we help them do that with our intuitive heat maps, just having an idea of where you are in the city and what to expect. Safe routing, as I mentioned, getting safely from point A to point B. Geofenced alerts. So if you wander off, into a new neighborhood, it'll ping you and propose an alternate route to your destination. So all these measures around preventative security. So like, let's not even get into a sticky situation in the first place. So preventative is important. And then also this element of crisis management. So what a lot of companies see is that they spend a lot of money on expensive emergency response systems. And several of the companies that we've been working with use the example of the earthquake that happened in Mexico City in September 2017. Some of them sent emergency alerts through their systems, and no one responded because they hadn't downloaded the app, or they didn't know what they were supposed to do. They hadn't been trained. All of these things. It's really, employees are super busy. They have their day-to-day tasks to deal with, so they're not thinking about emergency preparedness until that earthquake hits and the floor is shaking. So what we do with base operations is we provide all these services that have value in people's day-to-day lives, like the preventative services I mentioned earlier, routing, geofenced alerts, et cetera. And because we provide those on the day-to-day, when it comes to the emergency, people are already bought in and they know where to go. So when we piloted with Bain, they had, the earthquake had been incredibly disruptive for them. The security department ended up just giving up on their emergency systems and calling all the consultants one by one. When we ran an emergency earthquake drill with them, we set a success metric of 50% check-in rate within 24 hours, and we ended up with a 73% check-in rate within 24 hours. So, we're aiming for higher and higher with our next engagement. So, being able to count on business continuity, and these things will always happen. So as long as companies can respond quickly and keep operations moving, that's what's important to them, and it's important to us.
If you could recommend any books, blogs, podcasts, documentaries, what would they be?
So I consume a lot of content. And so in sort of the startup world and work world, I really like Without Fail from Gimlet as a podcast. I really like Harvard Business Review's Women at Work, specifically for female entrepreneurs or for anyone who works with women, which should be everyone. But I also think that it's really important to read fiction and history and not entirely read startup and entrepreneurship materials and business books all the time. For me personally, it's incredibly helpful to have a reset and, for at least 20 minutes a night, do something totally different so that I can come back fresh the next day. So right now I'm reading Say Nothing, which is a book about the Troubles in Northern Ireland by Patrick Wright and Keefe, which I really like. It's just a totally different context, and that helps me go back prepared in the morning.
You mentioned the podcast about women at work. What's been your experience being a woman in entrepreneurship?
It's I think it's a wonderful place for women to be. There's obvious challenges. So the widely cited statistic is that 2% of venture capital goes to female founders, and that's obviously much worse for female founders of color. But that's shocking. I mean, 2%. The people that know it well because it impacts them, and then other people are their jaws drop when they hear that. So there are a lot of challenges, like institutionalized challenges like that. But I do think that entrepreneurship is so great for women in so many ways. It really allows you to express, to sort of culminate all of your experience and create something, solve a problem that something about. And you don't have to necessarily fit into a rigid structure of a company that already exists. You can create your own culture. You can create your own solution. So I think, in that way, it's a great path for women. But yeah, there's certainly challenges. And I think I combat that through communities of female entrepreneurs. So, I'm here in Washington, D.C. I have a group of female entrepreneurs in security that I have dinner with occasionally. And we'll just talk about different challenges of being women in this particular industry that's so male dominated. So, being women entrepreneurs, which is a minority, selling into an industry that's pretty male dominated. But I also think, people want to help, and I think there's an appetite for a change, and people want to see more female entrepreneurs and invest in them. So I also feel really lucky to have benefited from a lot of women and men that want to right the disparity in funding.
And what advice would you give to other women who are just thinking about getting into entrepreneurship?
I think women tend to be more risk averse, and it's one of the reasons they avoid entrepreneurship. I think we're lucky to live in the U.S., which is a country that doesn't stigmatize failure as much as other countries. And so I think I would tell women to just go for it. And there's, if it doesn't work out, like there's a 90% chance, 95 that it won't, based on, statistical success of companies. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a failure. You learn so much along the way. And, just the experience of jumping into the deep end of the pool, you never know what can happen. So I would say just go for it. Don't overthink it.
And speaking of advice, what advice would you give yourself if you could go back to when you were just doing that business plan competition, knowing everything you know today?
I think I would say that the most important lesson I've learned is about finding and hiring the right people. And that's really challenging. I think a lot of people talk about that. But finding people that you can really trust. And at this early stage, I don't think, entrepreneurs should be doing a lot of managing. I think they should hire people who they inherently trust to, go off and execute on, as long as you're aligned on what the goals are. So I think, finding those right people and really putting the time into interviewing people and spending a lot of time with them. And then, letting go of people that aren't adding to the direction that everyone's trying to go in. So finding the right people.
What's next for Base Operations?
Base Operations has a lot of exciting things happening this summer. So we are rolling out with MetLife in a couple weeks. So we'll be doing a big engagement with them, working with several different segments of their population in Mexico City and running some interesting drills. I'm really excited to get the data back from that and show our investors and stakeholders, how people are responding. And then we're also finalizing an engagement with the Global 100 renewable energy company. And we'll be working with them hopefully in Brazil and Mexico. So that's really exciting. Hopefully making some hires, bringing on some interns, lots of, different events and things like that. So yeah, it's really fast paced. Earlier you asked, you asked where in the world am I? Yesterday I was in Chicago, today I'm in DC, tomorrow I'm in Boston. And so, soon I'll be in Mexico City. So it's just sort of jumping around all the time, but super exciting. And it's a great moment for us.
Well, it's going to be exciting to watch as you and the team grow the business over the next bit here. Thanks for taking the time to do the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Nate.
Thanks again for listening to this episode of Crossing Borders with my guest, Cory Siskind of Base Operations. As always, if you like the Crossing Borders podcast, please share it with a friend so that more people can learn about what's going on in Latin America and its tech ecosystem. Please be sure to check out latamlist.com for daily tech news updates from the region. And if you like this podcast or Latam List, check out Crossing Borders, the book, to learn more about doing business in Latin America. If you really, really like the podcast, please share it with a friend again and put a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks to Angel, Sofia, and Josefina for helping produce this podcast, and thanks to you for listening. Have a great rest of your day.